Jesus the Messiah. What we're going to be talking about today is church history in regard to Israel, the land, and the future of Israel. I have taught church history at the seminary level for several years, and one of the things that I have taught on is the whole issue of Israel and the land in church history. I think most of the messages you have heard so far have been in regard to what the Bible says about Israel. I want to make a contribution today by giving a historical perspective. We are going to be looking at several PowerPoint slides that discuss how the church has viewed Israel throughout history. There are 4 eras of church history that I'll be talking about. The first is the early church history. That takes place from around AD 100 through 450 AD. The second era is the Middle Ages from around 450 through 1517. The third era would be the Reformation era of the 1500s. And then the fourth era would be the post-Reformation era from 1600 on until today. So we will go ahead now and start with our first slide. Throughout church history, there have been 2 main approaches on how the church has viewed Israel. The first is what's called a replacement view, and the second view would be what we call a restoration view. We will start with the replacement view. The replacement view is that the church has replaced or superseded Israel as the people of God. This view says there is no future for Israel as a nation. It also holds that the church is the new Israel. As a whole, this view does not believe that Israel as a nation has a future in the plan of God. There are actually different forms of replacement theology, but altogether they would hold that the church is the new Israel and that national Israel is done in the plan of God. The second view is the restoration view, and this is the opposite of the replacement view. The restoration view holds that national Israel still has a place in God's plans. The restoration view understands that Israel has come under judgment for rejecting Jesus when he came the first time, but Israel's rejection is not permanent, and that Israel will be restored as a nation. This is the part where I get to preach a little bit. A lot of things that I'm telling you about today are coming from a historical perspective, but this is where I take 2 minutes to preach what the Word of God has to really say. The Bible does not teach replacement theology. The Bible teaches that there will be a coming restoration of Israel. Not only does the Old Testament teach that, but the New Testament teaches that on several occasions. The verses that you see up there, I am not going to quote all of them, but I will summarize what they say. In Luke chapter 1, the angel Gabriel promises that Jesus would rule over the nation Israel forever. In Matthew 19:28, Jesus said that in the renewal of the universe, that he was going to come sit on his glorious throne, and the 12 apostles would be ruling over the 12 tribes of Israel. That verse alone defeats replacement theology. In Acts chapter 1, the apostles, after 40 days of kingdom instruction from Jesus, they asked, "Lord, is it at this time you are restoring the kingdom to Israel?" This shows that the apostles were looking for the kingdom for Israel. Jesus does not say they were wrong. He only says that they are not to know the timing. In Romans chapter 9, verses 4 to 5, the apostle Paul says that the covenants and promises still belong to Israel. And he even mentions the temple service still belonging to them. In Romans chapter 11, verses 25 to 26, Paul explicitly says all Israel will be saved. And that is connected with the deliverer coming again, who is Jesus, and the new covenant belonging to Israel. In Revelation chapter 7, it talks about 144,000 Jewish people, and they are contrasted with the multitude of Gentiles. This shows that God still has a plan for the tribes of Israel. I myself am a Gentile. My father was born in Czechoslovakia, but I have a proper understanding of Genesis chapter 12, where we are told that from Abraham would come a great nation, and from that great nation, all the families and nations would be blessed. That takes place through the ultimate seed of Abraham, Jesus the Messiah. The mostly Gentile church throughout history has struggled with the idea that God still has a plan for Israel. Wherever there have been a lot of non-Jews, there has been a tendency to view Israel as being replaced by the church. Romans chapter 11, verse 1, Paul says, I say then, God has not rejected his people, has he? May it never be. He is speaking about the nation Israel. Paul would not have said such a thing if there were not people struggling with that issue. Around AD 150, a man named Justin Martyr became the first to call the church Israel. So we could say that replacement theology begins around the middle of the 2nd century. The early church did affirm premillennialism, which is the view that there would be a 1,000-year kingdom after the return of Jesus. That was a good thing. But there started to be more of a trend towards viewing replacement theology as the correct view. When you study people in church history, it's usually not all good or all bad. Justin Martyr, for example, did believe that there would be a salvation of a lot of Jewish people someday, and he believed that there was in premillennialism, but he did view the church as the new Israel. On that last part, I think he was in error. There ends up being 3 main reasons why the early church went more towards replacement theology. The first was the growing number of Gentiles in the church. And of course, Gentiles being saved is a great thing. But as I said earlier, oftentimes Gentiles would view Israel as being replaced. After Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70, the church became much, much more Gentile. The second main reason for a replacement theology was the perception of many that the destructions of Jerusalem in 70 and 135 were God's permanent rejection of Israel. And the key word there is the word permanent. I too believe that the AD 70 destruction was a punishment for unbelieving Israel at that time. But it was not a permanent rejection. But many in the church viewed those destructions as a permanent rejection of
그럼에도
Israel.
불구하고
The third part was the rise of allegorical interpretation. In the 200s and 300s, many started to interpret the Bible non-literally. They often took physical and national promises and made them spiritual promises. Physical promises were interpreted to be spiritual promises for the church. National promises were taken to be fulfilled with the church. There was one church father who said that the covenant made with Israel was no longer Israel's but the church's. That was found in the Epistle to Barnabas. When you put those 3 factors together, those were ingredients for the soup of replacement theology. And replacement theology would become very entrenched in the church from that point onward. There's a scholar who said that what is missing from the early church is the belief in a restoration of Israel. Yet, there were still some who did make some good statements about Israel during that time. Even Justin Martyr believed that there would be a lot of Jews saved in the end times. But he seemed to stop short in believing in a restoration of the nation Israel. When we talk about restoration, we mean that God is going to use Israel as a nation again. Remember that Jesus the Messiah is coming to rule the nations. That is what Revelation chapter 2, verses 26 to 27 states, and Psalm 2. Another church father was Tertullian. He lived in the 3rd century. He too believed that there would be a future for Israel. Then there was Jerome. He also made a statement that he believed the Jews would be saved in the end times. So there were some good statements during that time, but on the whole, after the 200s, there was a trend towards replacement theology. Since my message is about both Israel as a people and the land, I wanted to make a few statements about how the church viewed the land of Israel. The early church did not have much interest in the land of Israel. I want to make some comments here about the whole issue of pilgrimages to Israel. There was not much interest in Christians going to the land of Israel. Eventually, though, there would be more interest. Initially, the idea of a pilgrimage was something voluntary and optional. Jerome actually viewed pilgrimages to Israel as a good thing. He said if you could see Judea with your eyes, that would help your understanding of the Bible. But there were also other theologians who did not believe that visiting Israel would be beneficial. Augustine and Gregory actually discouraged Christians from visiting Israel. Constantine and Helena did much to encourage Christian interest in the Holy Land. They actually helped identify the sites in the Holy Land. And after them, there would be much more interest in Christians visiting Israel. Now we're going to transition to the next level of church history. We summarized the early church fathers. The early church had accepted replacement theology. The church had adopted what we call amillennialism, which is the view that Christ's kingdom is spiritual and now. So you are in the millennium now if they are right. I believe the correct view is that Jesus' millennium follows his second coming. But the church of the Middle Ages believed in amillennialism and had little belief in a future salvation or restoration of Israel. Israel was viewed as forever rejected by God. That will be a dominant view for about 1,000 years. As I searched the history of the Middle Ages, I found a couple glimmers of light. As a matter of fact, I had to look at a different language in order to even find hope for Israel. And I did find a statement from Thomas Aquinas, who is the most famous theologian of the Middle Ages. I won't read that whole quote, but he did believe that Romans 11 taught a future salvation of a lot of Jewish people. But he did not believe Israel would be restored to their land or have a future role as a nation in God's plan. The only person who I found did believe in a restoration of Israel was John of Rupskissa. He did believe Israel would be restored to the land, but his belief was very rare. The Crusades began in 1095 as a way to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. Pope Urban II believed that taking back the Holy Land could lead to the second coming of Jesus. Now we come to the Reformation period. And of course, with the Reformation period, we come to the important people of Martin Luther and John Calvin. The early reformers like Luther and Calvin still held on to replacement theology. I think they were more interested in other areas. Eschatology and Israel were not major concerns for them initially. They were fighting the Catholic Church on other areas. But Martin Luther did say some important things. And he's another one of these individuals who said some things good and then some things bad. In his early years, Martin Luther believed that he was living in the last days. And because he believed he was living in the last days, he fully expected the Jewish people to come to Jesus. Luther, though, became very discouraged with the Jews, and his positive approach became very negative. Martin Luther ended up saying some of the most negative things ever from a Christian figure. In 1543, he wrote a tract called Concerning the Jews and Their Lies. In that, he called for the Jews to be persecuted and for their synagogues to be burned. His words would end up being used by the Nazi regime. I'll just read you one statement here that Martin Luther stated. Therefore, the Jews have lost this promise. No matter how much they boast of their father Abraham, they are no longer the people of God. So as I study Martin Luther, I find myself personally torn. I am very grateful for his emphasis on justification through faith alone and his acceptance of the Bible as our only authority, yet very sad concerning his views of the Jews. Martin Luther held to replacement theology. He believed that the AD 70 destruction of Jerusalem was the permanent rejection of Israel. Now we move on to John Calvin. John Calvin also held to a form of replacement theology. He was not as harsh as Martin Luther was. And some scholars, let me start over. Very different Calvin scholars actually debate what his views of Israel actually were. In his Isaiah commentary, he makes some positive statement about the coming salvation of the Jewish people. But in other places, he strongly emphasizes that the church is Israel. So I would say his replacement theology was less harsh than Martin Luther's. Now I want to make some statements about the Geneva Study Bible. From this point forward, we're going to see more positive developments in how the church has viewed Israel. The first generation of the reformers held to replacement theology. But replacement theology's grip began to loosen when you get to the time around the 1600s. I think there are reasons for that. The Bible, because of the printing press, became much more accessible to the people. The common person could read what the Bible actually had to say, and that included what the Bible had to say about Israel. There was also an explosion of interest in studying Hebrew, and people started to take the Old Testament more literally. In the Geneva Study Bible, and this is from 1581, I'll go ahead and read this quote. Paul shows that the time shall come that the whole nation of the Jews, though not everyone particularly, shall be joined to the church of Christ. So in a short time period after Luther and Calvin, we find a statement that is much more positive about Israel. The 17th century would see an explosion of interest in the Jews in Israel. There is a scholar of the Puritans whose name is Ian Murray, and this is what he said. He said belief in a future conversion of the Jews became commonplace among the English Puritans. Ian Murray, this scholar, wrote a book called The Puritan Hope. And he has many quotes from Puritans affirming a future salvation and restoration of Israel. One of the reasons why that is important is because many today think that beliefs concerning a future for Israel began in the middle of the 1800s, when in reality, these changing views were starting around 1600. Here is one example. There was a man named Thomas Brightman. He wrote a commentary on the book of Revelation in 1615. And this is what he said. Shall they return to Jerusalem again? There is nothing more certain. The prophets do everywhere confirm it and beat upon it. But he has many statements about a future restoration of Israel. There's another man named Sir Henry Finch, and I will summarize what he said. But he made the statement that Israel has a future. That is, the church is not spiritual Israel, but literal Jews who come from the loins of Jacob. Okay, here is another quote from a man who wrote an award-winning article. He says, Puritan millennialists strongly asserted that the restoration and national conversion of the Jews was a prerequisite to the second coming. Within Dutch Reformed theology, there was also great interest in a future restoration of Israel. Wilhelmus A. Brockel said, one more question remains to be answered. Will the Jewish nation be gathered together again from all the regions of the world and from all the nations of the earth, among which they have been dispersed? He also asked, will they come to dwell in Canaan and all the lands promised to Abraham, and will Jerusalem be rebuilt? We believe that these events will transpire. And the next part of this quote is very important. He said, they will be an independent republic, governed by a very wise, good-natured, and superb government. If you remember in Isaiah chapter 9, when it's making a prediction about Jesus the Messiah, Isaiah 9 says the government will rest on his shoulders. That goes back to the truth we talked about earlier, that Jesus is coming to rule the nations from Israel. When Jesus comes again, we are not just all going to hold hands on a cloud. He is coming to rule and reign upon the earth. And the Bible tells us there will be nations that he will rule over. Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 to 4, tells us that there will be harmony among the nations at that time. And the nations will stream to Jerusalem to learn God's ways. So not only does God have plans for individuals, God also has a plan for nations. In Isaiah chapter 19, verses 24 to 25, the prophet mentions both Egypt and Assyria being the people of God. And it mentions Israel being the people of God as well during that time. So the statement up here, I think, is correct when he talks about the importance about a government for Israel. There was another important person during this time. His name was William Perkins. He too believed that there was going to be a future for the nation Israel. Okay, now here's a very important person in church history. His name is Jonathan Edwards, known as one of the greatest minds in church history. He was what we would call a postmillennialist. And he did believe that the millennium would take place between the two comings of Jesus. So I would not agree with everything that he says, but he did believe that there would be a future salvation of Israel. He said, however obstinate the Jews have been, now for above 1,700 years in their rejection of Christ, and however rare have been the instances on individual conversions, ever since the destruction of Jerusalem. But he said, and then shall the house of Israel be saved. The Jews in all their dispersions shall cast away their old infidelity, and shall have their hearts wonderfully changed, and abhor themselves for their past unbelief and obstinacy. Nothing is more certainly foretold than this national conversion of the Jews in Romans 11:2. Another famous person, the great preacher Charles Spurgeon. Charles Spurgeon said this, it is also certain that the Jews as a people will yet own Jesus of Nazareth, the son of David as their king, and that they will return to their own land. What is important there is the statement that he mentions them returning to their own land. He also says, native government again. There will again be the form of a body politic. A state shall be incorporated, and a king shall reign. Israel has now become alienated from her own land. If there be anything clear and plain, the literal sense and meaning of this passage, and he refers to Ezekiel chapter 37. Ezekiel 37 speaks about the restoration of Israel. It's the dry bones prophecy, where dry, dusty bones begin to come to life. Ezekiel 37 refers to the restoration of the tribes of Israel. Charles Spurgeon says that the meaning of this passage must not be spiritualized away, which is what a lot of people have done throughout church history. Many people think Ezekiel 37 is just referring to the church. Spurgeon understood it was speaking about a restored Israel. And as the rest of the quote indicates, it refers to the actual 12 tribes of Israel, which is what Revelation chapter 7, verses 4 to 8 talked about. Revelation mentions the specific tribes of Israel. The next thing we're going to talk about here is the rise of what is called dispensationalism. It sounds like one of those things that theologians make up. But what dispensationalism teaches is a good thing. John Nelson Darby is known as the founder of dispensationalism. And he believed that there would be a future salvation and restoration of Israel. And he took the Old Testament literally. Dispensationalism became very influential from the middle of the 1800s on until today. And dispensationalism taught a future for Israel. There have been many books written from this perspective. There have been many Bible conferences. There was a Bible conference movement in the late 1800s and early 1900s. In those conferences, people were studying the Old Testament and what God had to say about Israel. There also came to be many schools and Bible institutes at this particular time. Between 1800 and 1875, around 2,000 authors wrote about the Holy Land. So Christian thought about Israel that began to flower or unfold in the 1600s had really picked up momentum in the 1800s. You can tell by the amount of books written on Israel during this time. There were two very, very important events concerning Israel that took place in the 20th century. As a matter of fact, you could say these events were like earthquakes. Those two events were the Holocaust, where you had 6 million Jews killed, and the second event was the establishment of the modern state of Israel. These two events really caused a lot of Christians to reevaluate their views concerning Israel. As a matter of fact, many denominations who had held to replacement theology started to withdraw their support for replacement theology. I have a quote here from a man named Ronald DeProse who has studied this issue. He says, "Since the tragic events of the Holocaust and the birth of the modern state of Israel, the interest shown in God's ancient people has been widespread and sustained. Under the new conditions created by these events, the Christian churches have begun to consider anew their relation to the God of Israel in the light of the scriptures and the gospel about Jesus." A man named Oakes, he says that Christian reflections on the Jews and Judaism and after the Holocaust have generated theological questions of fundamental significance. But these questions have to do with challenging traditional views of replacement theology. So I think in the last 2 centuries, there has been a widespread reaction against replacement theology. That does not mean replacement theology has totally gone away. There are still many who hold to replacement theology. So it is not the case that all denominations have abandoned it. And I would even say that in the last couple of decades, that there has been in the evangelical church a resurgence of replacement theology. As one who studies in a seminary, I have noticed that many books have come out supporting replacement theology. It seems like there is a reaction to the last 2 centuries. And with that has come a resurgence in amillennialism and the view that the church has replaced Israel. So I think both sides are well represented with scholars today. So there's still a lot of work to be done. Those of us that care about these issues need to make sure that we have the right perspective. So let's do a summary. To summarize what we've said so far, the early church, the earliest of the early church, believed in a restoration of Israel. But as the early church era developed, it went more towards a replacement theology. When the Middle Ages began in around 500, replacement theology was strongly entrenched or in the church. When the Reformation came along in the 1500s, there was a strong interest in the Bible and much more interest in the Old Testament. So when you come to the 1600s, there ends up being an explosion of interest in Israel. And then when you had the Holocaust and the establishment of Israel in 1948, that even increased great interest in the future of Israel. But as it seems like it is today, there's been a reaction against the view of the restoration of Israel. And that's where we stand today. On a personal side, I think it's very important for Christians to have a right understanding of Israel and God's plans. For most of church history, Christians have downplayed the role of Israel. And we have to make sure that we are balanced on this issue. Those of us who love Israel have to make sure that we are also presenting the truth accurately. If you go back to Genesis chapter 12, we see that the nation Israel is being used as a vehicle or instrument for God's purposes. Genesis 12, 2-3, which we must all remember, teaches that the great nation will be used to bless the nations of the earth. So it is not the case that God is only concerned about Israel. Israel is being used by God to bless all nations. And that is very important for us to know. So, okay, that is the presentation on the history of Church Israel. And I would just like to express my appreciation to you, because I think understanding church history is very important. And as I'm closing, two main reasons why church history is important. First of all, it allows us to learn from godly people who have done things right in the past. And it also helps us to learn from the mistakes that have been made in the past. There's going to be a future generation someday who is going to look back and evaluate what we did. And my prayer would be that we would be on the right side of history. Father in heaven, we thank you for your truth. We thank you for Jesus the Messiah. We thank you that since the fall of man, that you had a plan to save mankind, and that you chose that Jesus would be the ultimate seed of Abraham to bring salvation to the world, to both believing Jews and Gentiles. Amen. Thank you very much.
감사합니다.